Well, I should preface my response by saying that, on the purists 20 years ago, one of the house rules was you don't talk about prices. And
اليوم على منصة وقت يسعدنا أن نستضيف جاك فورستر مدير التحرير العالمي لواتش بوكس. لكل من لا يعرف جاك فورستر، جاك بدأ مسيرة عمله الصحفية كمدير حوارات في منتدى بيورست برو للساعات في التسعينيات، قبل أن يصبح رئيس التحرير في مجلة ريفوليوشن الأمريكية في عام 2000، وبعدها أصبح من أوائل الموظفين في هودنكي حيث عمل فيها كمحرر ومن ثم كرئيس تحرير في عام 2015. وفي أغسطس من العام الماضي انضم جاك لواتش بوكس ليصبح مدير التحرير العالمي لواتش بوكس، واليوم نستضيفه هنا معنا في وقت. جاك, thank you for joining us and welcome to Dubai.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jack, we know you have been in this business as a journalist since the 90s. Correct me if I'm wrong, before also. How do you compare it back then to nowadays?
Well, when I first started writing about watches and talking about watches on the internet, there was barely an internet. So this is probably the mid 1990s, late 1990s, and there were no websites really. Conversation about watches took place on very, very primitive electronic bulletin board services. The funny thing is the conversations were basically the same. They haven't changed all that much. I mean, the products have changed, but the things people argue about have pretty much stayed the same. People love Rolex, people hate Rolex, people love Omega, people hate Omega. In-house is important, in-house is not important.
Exactly.
So all the basic things that people love to talk about and agree about or disagree about haven't changed. Now, what has changed are the products. Obviously, we're not talking about the same watches in 2023 that we were talking about in 1999 or 2003, I suppose. But most of the conversation about watches takes place in real time on the internet. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, that whole sort of space for dialogue about watches was still in its infancy. So if you wanted to talk to other watch enthusiasts in the very beginning, a lot of the time you had to go and actually meet people in person. And then what happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s was the first generation of discussion forums for watch enthusiasts came about. And this included thepurist.com, which is now called Purist Pro, and Time Zone. Those were the two big ones. And those were the first...
They started in the beginning.
Yes. Yeah. And those were the first places where, there were other discussion forums as well. Those were the two that I was most familiar with and was most present on. And for the first time, people could actually have conversations more or less in real time about watches. People could actually post photographs of watches. As the 2000s progressed, it became possible for people to post very high quality, very high resolution pictures of watches. And it changed the way that watch discussion took place. And then in the mid 2000s, we had the birth of Facebook and the birth of Instagram, excuse me.
Yep.
And I think probably the single biggest platform for talking about watches nowadays, well, obviously it's Instagram. That's where a lot of the dialogue about watches takes place. A lot of watch sales and watch trading takes place there. The rate at which, the speed with which it's possible to become a watch expert has changed dramatically. So, in the sort of pre-internet days or early internet days, if you wanted to become knowledgeable about watches, it could literally take years. You would have to read magazines on a regular basis, buy books. And I think today, because of the sheer amount of information that's been published to the internet, you can become a pretty solid watch expert in months, in a period of months.
If not a few weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a tremendous amount of information available now. There's a tremendous amount of high quality information now. There's a certain amount of disinformation and misinformation because, if anybody can publish, then mistakes are going to be published. And,
exactly.
and sometimes these errors in matters of fact or in matters of history can be, perpetuated for a very long time before they're corrected by the community. But overall, I think that that's the single biggest change. The speed with which we can talk about watches and acquire information has changed out of all recognition.
But to make sure if there are mistakes or not, now it's so easy, or let's say easier, to access the brands, to reach the brands. Unlike before, it is like a hustle to reach the CEO or the management, especially us here in the Middle East. It is. Okay, what do you think about the Middle East or Arab watch communities and Middle East collectors?
Well, whenever I come to Dubai, the thing that I'm probably the most impressed by is the level of enthusiasm for watches that exists in the Arab watch community, and the general level of knowledge. So I think that there are probably more serious collectors of fine watchmaking per square kilometer in Dubai than any place else on earth.
You compare the size of the
yeah. I mean, it's really impressive, and everybody knows so much, but even the people who are very, very knowledgeable are really eager to learn more. They're really eager to have dialogue and companionship with other watch enthusiasts. It's really impressive. There's a little bit of, I don't know that I would call it burnout necessarily, but in New York and in the United States, for example, the watch community, I think seems to be going through a little bit of a period of mental and emotional exhaustion. And it's natural for these things to happen in enthusiast communities. You sort of cycle through periods of being very, very happy about the thing that you're interested in, whether it's watches or cars or what have you, and periods of being a little bit more sort of questioning and maybe a little bit tired, a little bit exhausted. But here, every time I come here, the collectors that I talk to, the watch enthusiasts that I talk to, they love watches. I mean, not that they don't in the United States or in other markets, but the level of enthusiasm here and the openness to communication, collaboration, and to new information, I think is right now it's probably greater in the Arab watch community than anywhere else.
Great. Okay. Since you joined Watchbox, we assume that you know little more about the prices and market situation now than before. So what do you think, what happened past 2 years to the market, the crazy, the prices has increased insanely. Then all of a sudden we see this drop in the market and the prices.
Well, I should preface my response by saying that, on the purists 20 years ago, one of the house rules was you don't talk about prices. And the nice thing about that was that, you talked about watches and not how much you could trade them for or how much you paid for them. But of course, how much you pay for a watch and whether or not the watch retains its value is a big part of what people think about when they buy watches.
Exactly, part of a journey.
Yeah, so it was. It was a good rule then. I think it would be a completely unrealistic rule now. As a watch journalist, I'm in the fortunate position of not being able to afford most of the things that I write about. So I don't, I don't worry about prices typically. But for sure, what we have seen, and it's not just in the last 2 years or the last 5 years, but really over the last couple of decades, maybe the last 20 to 25 years, we've seen a steady increase in the prices for watches, both traded pre-owned, vintage, and especially new watches. So the prices for new watches sold at retail from Switzerland have been going up steadily. Sometimes, if you look at a watch from a blue chip brand like Patek Philippe or Vacheron or Audemars Piguet, you can see that the retail price now is sometimes 4 times, 5 times what it was 20 years ago. So that has driven the enthusiast community and the collector community to become more and more used to the idea of paying
higher prices.
Very high prices. And in the last 5 years, I think that the huge increase in prices that we have seen for certain premium models, really desirable models on the pre-owned watch market, I think that's been driven a lot by the internet. So, the classic examples, of course, are stainless steel luxury sports watches like the Royal Oak and the Nautilus. Yeah, the 5711 is the classic example of the so-called hype watch.
Yes.
And it's a simple question of supply and demand. Lots and lots of people want a relatively small number of watches and a relatively small number of models. And so, of course, people are chasing those and willing to pay whatever it takes in order to get them.
Exactly.
Now, the Nautilus, for example, the 5711, it's not a complicated watch. It's not particularly. It's a beautiful watch, of course, but
luxury sports watch.
Yeah, luxury sports watch. Yeah, but it's an easy watch to recognize. The high price that you pay for it means that if you're wearing one, it's an instantly visible status sign, and there's nothing wrong with that. People buy watches for all sorts of excuse me,
So,
People buy watches for all sorts of different reasons. It's a beautiful watch. It's a historically important watch. Should it be a six-figure watch? Well, should is not really the question. I mean, it is, in fact, a five-figure, six-figure watch over the last 5 years. And that's simply because the demand is at an unprecedented high, and there are just a limited number of them that are available to purchase at any given time. And the same thing has happened with highly desirable brands and highly desirable watches which are sold new at retail. So Rolex is the perfect example. I mean, to buy a stainless steel Rolex sports model is more difficult now than it has ever been in the entire time that I've been looking at watches and thinking about watches. And that's because the demand is at an unprecedented high. You know, when I first got interested in watches back in the 1990s, you know, largely there was no internet, or it was in very early days for the internet. And the watch magazines, such as they were not prominently displayed in newsstands. They were, you know, the bottom back magazine rack next to, I mean, in the United States, this is literally where they were. They were next to the doll collecting and the model railroad magazines and the coin collecting magazines. So if you were collecting watches back in the 1990s and you were buying watch magazines, you were kind of a weirdo. You know, I mean, this was not kind of a thing that a normal, rational person was interested in. And now watches are mainstream. You know, there are probably hundreds of millions more people interested in watches now than there were in 1999 or in 2000.
You go to lounges, you go to the find sometimes restaurants, you find them there. Yeah. So they've become a very much a major part of the larger public discourse on luxury lifestyle and luxury products. And you know, Rolex makes 1 million watches a year, and they can't just turn on the tap and make 2 million watches a year. Exactly.
You know, this is not something that people necessarily think about all that much as customers for Rolex watches, but one of the things that distinguishes Rolex is their quality control is very, very high. You just don't see people putting up pictures of Rolex watches that they have bought that end up having manufacturing defects, right? So, and in order for them to make 1 million watches a year, every single watch is +2, -2 per day, every single one. And they are all completed in the factory to an identically high level of quality. In order for Rolex to do that, they have to have highly rationalized production lines. And making 2 million watches a year instead of 1 million watches a year, if they decide to do that and they want to do it over a 1-year period, then quality goes down. Quality control goes down. The ability to control the quality of what they put out into the world goes down. And Rolex doesn't want to do that. And they don't particularly have any incentive to make 2 million watches per year because, you know, to say that Rolex has a strong business model is to say nothing at all. I mean, they're doing just fine. They don't need to make 2 million watches.
Yes, they don't.
So they're just sort of sticking to their guns and producing the highest quality watch that they can with the production lines that they have. And again, part of the problem is changing their production lines would be, it would be a multi-year effort. It would be a decades-long effort. But because the demand keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, the number of people who want the number of people who want these watches has changed. The number of watches has not
bigger
changed.
as well.
So it's simple supply and demand.
Supply and demand.
So both in the pre-owned market, in the vintage market, and in the new watch market, it's not a complicated problem. And the answer to the question why do prices keep going up is the very first law of basic economics. It's just supply and demand.
And I would add something. I would say maybe now the knowledge, the social media. It's easy to know about watches.
Absolutely.
Everybody can show off their watches as well. Some of them, not everybody is a collector. Not some of them, they want one watch to enjoy it for a long time and have it. And so to choose the watch now is so easy with the social media. To know about watches also 10 times easier than before. I'm sure you know better.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's you know, and also when people first enter a particular enthusiast sphere of knowledge, you know, whether it's watches or wine or you know, men's style or cars or what have you, there are the things that you hear of first that are easy to understand and that everybody kind of acknowledges are important. So you know, when you first get interested in if you're a wine connoisseur, for instance, you know, you hear about certain big names first, and you know, you try those, and you can sort of develop your own taste and decide what you like, what you don't like. But you're not necessarily seeking out something obscure that not a lot of people have heard of but that's interesting to you because you've tried all the other stuff already. So with watches, for instance, you know, obviously the first name that anybody hears when they hear about luxury watches is Rolex, right? But if you start getting interested in luxury watches in general and you start reading about them, there are certain brands that you just hear about over and over and over again. So, you know, Audemars Piguet, for instance, you might not start out knowing that Audemars Piguet exists. You might not start out knowing what kinds of watches they make. But if you say to yourself, you know what, I want to learn something about luxury watches, you're going to find out about Audemars Piguet in about 5 minutes. You know,
I'm better.
You start there, and you don't necessarily progress from being obsessed with Patek, being obsessed with Rolex, being obsessed with Audemars Piguet terribly, terribly rapidly. I mean, with wine, for instance, you know, you go to a restaurant and you spend $100 on a bottle of wine or $200 on a bottle of wine. It's not that much of an investment, and you can taste and you can say to yourself, oh, okay, I like Bordeaux or I don't like Bordeaux. I like Burgundy or I don't like Burgundy. And you sort of go from there. But with watches, it's very expensive
Exactly.
to develop your own taste. You know, $30 on a glass of good wine can really advance your knowledge of wine and your personal taste. To have the same experience in watches, you have to spend $50,000.
Yeah.
You know, so knowledge progresses very, very slowly, and the more money you spend, the more inclined you are to stay committed to what you spent money on. You know, it's like the old joke about buying fake art. You know, the more money you spend on a fake painting, the more inclined you are to think that it's real. Which is not to say that people are buying fake watches, but the analogy basically has to do with the commitment that people have to whatever they've spent a great deal of money on and worked hard to acquire.
I have a personal question.
Sure.
What is the grail watch to Jack Forster?
Oh boy. You know, I'm lucky in that as a watch writer, I get to see and experience a lot of watches. There are many, many watches over the years that I've seen and thought to myself, wow, I would really love to own that watch. At this point, if money were no object,
Yes, we are talking about money.
If money weren't a consideration, I would go to Roger Smith and I would ask him to make a watch for me. That's the simplest answer, you know. And is his watchmaking better than anyone else's? Is it better than any other independent watchmakers? I mean, you know, who knows? That's not really an answerable question.
It's a matter of taste.
It's a matter of taste, yeah. I mean, I love Philippe Dufour's watchmaking. I love F.P. Journe's watchmaking. I love the watchmaking at Debethune. Recep at Akrivia, I think, is making wonderful, wonderful watches nowadays. There's a lot of people whose work I would love to collect and I would love to explore. But I think right now for me, and I've known him for, I've had the privilege to know Roger Smith for several years right at this point. Interviewed him a couple of times when I was at Hodinkee, and I love his approach to watchmaking. I love how rooted in English watchmaking history his watches are, and I think that's what I would do.
Great. What do you think about Dubai Watch Week? And are you going to attend it this year?
Definitely going to attend this year. And I think that Dubai Watch Week has become, in a lot of ways, one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting events on the watch calendar. So, you know, for years when I first started, everybody looked forward to Basel World, and there's no Basel World anymore.
Yes.
Which is a shame because it was, 100 years. Watches were shown at Basel once a year, and we all miss it. I think that all watch journalists who've been around for a while miss Basel, but it's not coming back.
Yeah.
Then there's Watches and Wonders, and lots of fantastic things to see at Watches and Wonders. And since it takes place in Geneva, there's a lot of other watch brands who are not formally part of Watches and Wonders who show
theirs around it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think for me, Dubai Watch Week reflects the general level of enthusiasm and level of excitement about watches that you see in the Arab watch community in a larger sense. So, every time I go to Dubai Watch Week, you can see a huge range of watches, really, really fascinating independents, making a very small number of watches on one end of the spectrum. And then, at the other end of the spectrum, Rolex was a participant, the last time that I was here, and everything in between. And because there are not hundreds of exhibitors the way there were at Basel World, because it's a more focused group of watches and a more focused group of watchmakers, you can really take time to explore and experience the difference between each one of the exhibiting brands. So it's really quite fantastic. I mean, you have a really great balance between the number of exhibitors and the variety of exhibitors. and the warmth and enthusiasm of the watch community, I think it really kind of gives Dubai Watch Week a feeling of really genuine enthusiasm for watches that you don't necessarily get at the bigger trade shows.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I've been in most of those exhibitions, and Dubai Watch Week is always different.
Yeah.
I know people think I'm biased here, but this is really my personal feelings. We asked you to pick two watches from the exhibition, or Debutone and Bijon. You picked those two beautiful watches. Tell us why and tell us about them.
Well, so the exhibition, just for those viewers who might not know what the specific focus was, Watchbox has a very large collection of Debitone watches and a very large collection of watches by F.P. Jörn, and those two brands and those two watchmakers, Denis Flageolet at Debitone and Francois Paul, obviously, Francois Paul Jörn, these two gentlemen have been enormously influential in the history of independent watchmaking and in the history of complicated watchmaking and watch design over the last 2 decades and longer. So having them both together, having an exhibition that focuses on the watchmaking of both of those brands is really a way of looking through a very particular kind of lens at the history of modern watch design and the evolution of complicated watchmaking in the 21st century. Now, why these two particular watches? So on the one hand, we have a subscription piece made by Francois Paul Jörn very, very early in his career and very early in the history of his brand. Now, these watches were they were made on the subscription model, the so-called subscription model, which was invented by Breguet in the early 19th century as a way of making it possible for people to buy one of his watches by basically putting down a down payment and then paying the rest when the watch was actually ready. And this particular watch is, this was Francois Paul Jörn's arguably most important early watch, the Tourbillon Souverain, tourbillon wristwatch with a remontoire with a mechanism for controlling the amount of energy delivered to the escapement. And they're extremely rare. This is 18 out of 20. And the great thing about the subscription watches is there's never going to be any more of them, obviously, unless you have a time machine and you want to, you can sit in your time machine and go back to the beginning of the 21st century and commission another one. So there's excuse me. So there's a very limited number of them. They represent extremely sophisticated watchmaking. Obviously, they're all handmade watches. Each one of them bears the kind of individual mark of the hands of Francois Paul Jörn himself. And if you are interested in complicated watchmaking, the history of the tourbillon, the evolution of watchmaking in the 21st century, the birth of independent horology as a major kind of player in the world of watches, there really isn't anything like it. I mean, this particular watch and the subscription series, the early subscription watches in general from F.P. Jörn, are coveted by serious collectors in general and by serious F.P. Jörn collectors. And the guarantee of rarity and the small number of actual watches that exist, I think is something that's going to make them not only hold their value, but continue to be really museum pieces, important representatives of the history of a certain period in watchmaking for the foreseeable future. So that's this watch by Francois Paul. Now, this particular watch by Debitone is one of their latest models, and they call it the kind of two because it's kind of two watches.
Yes.
So we have a watch with a rotating case, and there's a history of watches with reversible cases. Obviously, the Reverso is one. The Cartier Tank Basculant is another.
Yeah.
This one has two faces, one for showing the time in one time zone and one for showing the time in another time zone. But it has two very different looking faces as well. So often with reversible watches, there are exceptions, of course, in Jaeger-LeCoultre's production of Reversos. Some of the two-faced ones have similar faces, and some of them
has four. The quadruptic one has four faces.
It's one of my favorite watches, by the way. I mean, it's just a crazy, crazy piece of.
And it's a nice brand, Jaeger-LeCoultre.
Yeah. It's a wonderful brand, one of my favorites. So here, in addition to being able to see the time, the time in two different locations, you actually have a completely different visual experience. So you have the sort of quote unquote normal face, which shows the time in the conventional fashion, and the only thing that gives you a clue that you're looking at a very different kind of watch is it's a mechanical watch, but the seconds hand is advancing in 1 second beats. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Looks like a quartz watch, but it's actually what's called a deadbeat seconds. That's the traditional name for it. You know, deadbeat in English slang means somebody who sits around and doesn't do anything. So the brands kind of don't like it if you call it a deadbeat seconds.
Yeah, okay, it's a new thing to know.
It's just an interesting English idiom. But then you turn the watch over and you look at the movement from the other side, and you have this incredible display of very, very avant-garde watch design, with the time being displayed in a very unconventional fashion. And the watch itself, although it's somewhat large, is very comfortable to wear because of this articulated lug system, you know, the lugs. So you look at these two watches, and they come from different times, they come from different brands, and they sort of express different philosophies about watchmaking. Francois Paul doesn't really change his watch cases all that much, you know, very, very classical designs. Denis Flageolet at Débéton changes. I mean, the number of different cases that they've produced, the number of different designs they've produced, it's phenomenal, and yet they all are recognizably Débéton watches.
Yes.
And these two gentlemen together, I think, represent complementary poles of watchmaking. And in this brand new watch, and in this one from the very beginning of the career of F.P. Jauregn as his own brand, because obviously he was making very, very complicated watches and sophisticated timepieces before then. If I had to pick two watches from this collection, this one represents where we are now.
Contemporary.
Yes, contemporary. And this one represents where we came from. And this together really frame and sell up, I think, the entire traveling exhibition that we've brought to Dubai. And I think that they sum up a very, very important aspect of the history of independent watchmaking in the 21st century in general.
Jack Forster, thank you for coming on with me.
Thank you so much.
Looking forward to see you on our Waqt platform again soon.
Yes, I certainly hope so, and it's a pleasure to be here. And as always, it's a pleasure to feel so welcomed here in Dubai by the Arab watch community and the Dubai watch community. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.